Hello again, members. I'm Catherine McMacken, and I'm the membership manager here at the Henry Ford. Today is the first day of our periodic member appreciation days. And as we start this special weekend, I'm so happy to welcome you back for our first virtual program for members in 2021, Farming Before the Factory. We'll find out today how generations of Michiganders foraged and farmed along the Rouge River before Henry Ford developed the iconic Ford Rouge Complex on its shores. And it'll be our own curator of agriculture and the environment, Debra Reid, who leads us on an exploration of archival material from our collections to learn about these early farmers. Now, many of you have met Deb in previous member programs, and you know she loves a research challenge. She loves to dig through our archives to uncover those special stories that bring the past to life and provide context to our present day. And even better, she's generous. She loves to share these stories with all of us. So while you enjoy the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. And you know, it's been nearly a year that a lot of us have shifted to spending more time apart and haven't been experiencing our member community like we used to. So if you like, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat feature with your first name and where you're joining us from. We can kind of see each other virtually that way. And as always, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We continue to be so grateful that you join us in our commitment to our mission through all of the unprecedented challenges we've all faced recently. So now I'll hand it over to Deb to take us back to the early days of farming along the shores of the Rouge River.
Thank you so much, Kat. It is always a pleasure to share the research from the archive and our collections with the THF members. And this shows pretty well the contrast between the bit of the Rouge that existed in the vicinity of the Rouge plant before Henry Ford began to purchase the acreage, and then the Rouge plant construction begins. So as a curator of agriculture and the environment, I had intense interest in what was going on this river bottom land before the Rouge. And when I toured the Ford Rouge factory once, I saw, this is my memory, I saw a sign that indicated that some of the acreage was acquired for a minuscule sum of $1,100. And the text further explained that the marshland is, quote, too muddy for farming, unquote. Now, that's undoubtedly true about some of the marshland that was along the Rouge in its original situation. But Jackie Clark, who is the floor supervisor at the Rouge factory tour, and I wondered what the rest of the story was. This presentation began for an April 2018 training for the presenters at the Rouge. And I am still learning more about it. So, but in brief, I've learned that generations of folks who lived along it foraged and farmed. And that all happened up to the day when Henry Ford accumulated about 1,500 acres and then sold it to the Ford Motor Company as the new Rouge plant. And we'll learn about some of these early farmers and the ways they interacted with the river and the ways that their work served themselves and populations beyond the Rouge. So a bit of the Rouge, the photographers love this place, and this is a good example of an illustration, artistic illustration of a river that it looks too low to navigate in this particular image, but could be a flooding torrent at other times. That flood always replenished the lands on either side. That river was utilitarian in that it drained Wayne County. So, and in the age when flowing water affected the mechanics of rural industry, it was valuable indeed to have branches of a main stream close for water, supplies for livestock, flooding of those alluvial, often pasture lands and crop fields, and then eventually, even more, when it's harnessed, the power of the water fuels additional industries. But you can see the red line is the main body of the Rouge, and then what we will be talking about is from the confluence of those branches down to the Detroit River. The Rouge meandered in its natural style. And the very bottom of the slide that you're looking at now shows the meandering Rouge and where it flows into the Detroit River, as it flows around Zug Island, as it then, well, it's flowing the other way, but we'll work our way up as if we were in our own kayak to the area where it begins to branch. And you can, if you can see well enough, the spaces between the Rouleau Creek, which is right by the eye in Spring Wells, over to the left to about DeRocher. That's the area that, here, maybe I can highlight that with my, yeah, this is the area that becomes the Rouge factory. Those French long lots radiated from the river as a traditional French settlement pattern. It allowed every farm family to have access to the major transportation route at that time, which was the waterway. And then the flooding also replenished every farmer who had a lot, their plant fields. But people before the French lived and survived and sustained themselves on the water and the areas near. Many of you have perhaps seen these illustrations. An 1849 plat map has the little crosshatches that designate the mounds that were built in this, with this sandy sediment that goes along the Detroit River and also there on the island. And you can see those blown up a little bit, and you can see how that relates to the place on the Spring Wells Township map from 1860. The archaeologists explored these mounds, already often seriously compromised, taken down for sand sources, plumaged, or yeah, destroyed, excavated for various reasons over the years. But it's the lasting evidence that people, both prehistoric and into the contact period, resided in these places. The places that we might not think of as having any value, like this area that's marshy, thanks to the Burton Historical Collection for images like this. And yet these are very important natural ecosystems. They sustain the waterways, they help particulates settle out of water before it goes into the Detroit River and onto the lakes. There are areas where there was berries and other grasses and plants that people consumed. It was an area that drew fauna, so wild animals of all kinds. Very important to many different inhabitants' food supplies. And then another illustration of the ways that settlers begin to parcel out this land. And you can see the long lots. Up here is the Rouge, and there are the series of long lots that radiate from it. Now, who were the people that settled in these places? From this John Farmer map, I wanted to point out, just a couple of names. And one of them is the Burbanks. And we think here at the Henry Ford, always when we hear the name Burbank, we think of Luther Burbank. There is absolutely no relationship that we know of, and we have done a fair bit of investigating between this Burbank, who owned almost 185 acres in a long lot, and the Luther Burbank family had lived in Massachusetts before many of the family moved to California. So this Burbank was here decades before, in the earliest days of the French settlement. Burbank show up in some of the conversations and the official documents related to land transfer, related to political transfers after, well, when the Americans take over Detroit, I guess you could say it like that. The Burbanks show up in many lawsuits because the patron of the Burbank family dies, leaving a wife and several children and a fair amount of land. This matters because one of the few illustrations, one of the few illustrations that we have of a farm that was in this area of the Rouge that we've identified to date is this image of the Burbank farm. Hence the reasons why we're trying to find out more about this particular Burbank family. I'm going to go backwards just a second again, but this Burbank, eventually his young children marry the children of Francois Chauvin and James Sisney. So Burbank relatives own some of this land that's on the north side, and within that area that becomes the Rouge plant. Francois de Roche has some role to play in the settlements of the estate of the Burbank deceased. And these Burbanks live in and around Dearborn into the 1880s. So it's through this detailed genealogical, I guess you'd say, investigation that you begin to find descendants and then possibly information about who specifically these people were who farmed this place. Now, while we're looking at these early maps, I also wanted to show you why does Henry Ford acquire this particular property? Well, there are folks that have studied that, logistical reasons for the factory construction of that new plant. But in yellow highlight here are the two schools that Henry Ford attended. And here's William Ford, Henry's father, and the property on both sides in Dearborn Township and Springwells Township at this time. Miller School is very close. You will see, in fact, D. Miller on a map we'll look at shortly, right at the edge of that property that Ford later purchases, that 1,500 acres that becomes the Rouge plant. So there's a proximity and a personal relationship between Ford and many of the people that lived in this place. We still aren't sure how Henry Ford acquired a print of this particular photograph. That photograph is illustrated in Dearborn, A Pictorial History by Eleanor Eaton, and a person credited as providing this illustration to that publication. At some point, and this was very common, Ford Motor Company staff photographed images. And at some point, someone did that to this very one, thankfully. So because we have an image of what these riverside farms look like, and it is rich. So I'm going to take just a second to help you, focus in on some areas. you may or may not be able to make out, there is a boat in the river, and it looks like there's a child at the oars. There are also two women with bonnets standing at the edge, both of them with white or light colored aprons. And then you may, if your screen's big enough, be able to see at least one dog, but I believe there are two dogs standing there. You can just see them wagging their tail. Is the person going out, or has the person just returned? Well, that's a good question. And then as we move back, you can see there's spaces between the river and the fence rows. So there's this, area that the river possesses at different times in its seasons. But then you see board fence, gate, and a building that looks like it's propped up with sticks, or not sticks, but poles. I wonder, is that the privy, which would have been the, good location for the privy. Behind that, barns. And then on the other side of the tree, what looks like a corn crib, and then the house, and then a spring house, perhaps, up on a higher elevation, so less prone to flooding. In the front, you see a walking path, and then probably a roadway. This is a spot, it's prime real estate in that time on this alluvial river. So with this image in mind, I think, okay, how do I find out more? Well, I have a lot more research to do. I need to look at the 1860, 70, and 80 census records to document people in this location, meaning on that 1,500 acres. The 60, 70, and 80 census is a population census as well as manuscript agricultural census. And from that agricultural census, we can document what the farm families reported as their acreage, their improved acreage, the amount of wood they cut and sold, the pounds of fleece they raised, the cattle, the horses, the corn, the wheat, and on and on. We have that data for farmers like William Ford. No one that I know of has looked in detail at the farmers that can be documented as living on these 1,500 acres of land. In 1890, those manuscript schedules are not available, but there is some details that I can find on Wayne County farm production to give a general sense of how spring wells may have fit in. But the plat maps, if we can locate any, you'll see a plat map here shortly, but for 1890, you really have to rely on local records, including township plat maps, to document people and places. Really what I was looking for was, do any of these folks work, meaning sell their fresh fruits and vegetables at the central market? So I'm looking for market connections. We have beautiful watercolors of the river that show the industry and show a boat similar to what that Burbank family had in that photograph. But what lies on the other side, behind the person seeing this, are those productive fields. So who were some of these people? Now we're into the population census of 1910. And I understand that you may not be able to read this, but there is a truck farmer identified, Mr. John Daigle. And by George, there's another truck farmer identified. This is John Dubke. Couple more general farmers you can see there listed. This census also will tell us if they own their property or if they're renting their property. So I'm not going to go back, but I know from other maps that Daigle and Dubke both own their farms. You just go down a little bit, there's a fella that's renting his farm, and that I think is Gottlieb Friedrich. And that's tough to read for all of us. But that Gottlieb does not show up on the maps of property owners because he's a renter. So I just offer him as an example of people that may have very well farmed for more than, for 20 or 30 years, this property, but not be in some records because they rented instead of owned. And you can see on the left-hand side here, the census enumerator tells us these are folks living along Miller Road. Now the next map or the next census we're going to look at, he continues along Miller Road. And we see a Charles Schmidt and an Alexis Schmidt. And then there's also a Nicholas Schneider. Now, names that are familiar to us, in addition to all the Millers, because when we get to the 1915 Wayne County map, an atlas of this area, and this is what becomes the Rouge plant, there's Daigle and Dubke. And then if you move on up Miller Road, and there's Miller Road, you'll see Charles Schmidt. And then if you go down the other side, Mr. Schneider is up here under, you may not be able to see that name, but Nicholas Schneider is at the very top of the map. So this just gives you a little indication with a bigger print who you'll see or who I would look for if I was looking for farmers in this place. Just a second. Now, before I continue, there's this this name on several parts of this map, the Dinan brothers. The Dinan brothers were a wholesale grocery firm. In other words, they bought land as it became available, and then they had tenant farmers farm the land for them. The Dinan brothers actually owned several parcels in Springwells, as you can see, and they had a well-stocked grocery, and they needed to have the farmers producing the fresh fruits and vegetables for that grocery. One of the brothers died before Ford began to acquire this property, and then the brother James retired in 1920. But the business then continued with other Dinans and dependent upon farmers that were farther out of town. So farmers that they might take the money that Ford paid them for their property and then acquire much more acreage farther away from the city in the country. But the transportation networks, especially the railroads, could allow them still to be market gardeners or truck farmers for, well, especially truck farmers for people like the Dinan brothers. What's the difference between what's a truck farmer and what's, what does all these terms mean? Differences between people who just raise fruits and vegetables for themselves or for a market or for truck farming. So every one of the farmers, general farmers or market gardeners or truck farmers, would be growing for their own family. They are also growing for market, those that are market gardeners. So they might have a stall in a vegetable market, or they might contract with a greengrocer or a wholesale grocer like the Dinan brothers. They also, if they're more truck farmers, would contract with a canning company or some other processing business. And then there are horticulturalists growing ornamental plants and flowering shrubs and trees, apple trees, pear trees, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of different approaches that kitchen gardens, field gardens, nurseries, market gardeners, and truck farmers operated. As of now, I've documented general farmers, a couple of truck farmers, and farmers growing for the wholesale grocers. And this research is really in its infancy. So while we can look at a bucolic image like this of another apparently young people in a rowboat on the Rouge, we think about the other side of that, the hard work to feed people or populations. Now we're going to shift towards the industrial aspect of this. And the process of acquiring the land and building the factory. So many of these photos, and if you're interested, the digital collections through the Henry Ford website keeps growing exponentially. So there are now a lot of these Ford Rouge plant construction images available for you to see. I believe what's happening here, there is a dredge with the smoke coming out of its stack in the middle of the image. And I believe it's deepening the channel that may very well have at its, when we were looking at these earlier maps, been the Rouleau Creek. But definitely there was a lot of dredging that had to take place, and Ford Motor Company worked with the Army Corps of Engineers to modify the river in this way. Now, let me go to and I'm gonna leave this one up for a while as I talk to you about how Ford came to acquire this property. And historians have assessed this. David L. Lewis, who really wrote about the public image of Henry Ford, described Ford's plans to build this plant 10 miles south of the Highland Park plant and the obstacles that he encountered. Perhaps with a bit more attention to the factory construction, Ford R. Bryan looks into the Ford conception of the plant, integrating the iron processing with the vehicle manufacturing. He says that this is in Ford's mind clearly by 1913. Well, for sure, during the summer of May of 1915, Ford begins to instruct his agent, his real estate agent, Fred Gregory, to begin to buy lots. So in May of 1915, Henry and Fred Gregory take a walk with some of the Ford Motor Company officials around the 1,115.12 acres that are purchased at this time in parcels. The Ford Motor Company directors agreed to buy them from Ford. And I've mentioned the perimeters of this, but I'm going to state it one more time. The site is bounded on the north by the Michigan Central Railroad, bounded on the east by the Pere Marquette Railroad, the south by Dix Avenue and the River Rouge, and the north by a line approximately 50 feet east, extended to the river. The western boundary was Maples Road, basically. So how does this come about? Ford, for example, in July, purchases 16 acres from Mr. Padberg, and his property was way up on right next to the Michigan Railroad right-of-way. And this is likely Joseph Padberg. Ford pays $1,600 an acre, and that was paid to Padberg on July 9th, 1915. And the payments average $1,100 to $1,600 per acre. Now, when Ford Motor Company buys this acreage from Henry Ford, the Ford Motor Company pays a total of 1,778 and 80 cents per acre. So that's $1,778.80 per acre. Why? Because Ford had negotiated that there is the return on his investment of what he paid per acre. There's the payment reimbursing Ford for the taxes that he paid on these acreage over the years. There's the legal fees. There is also a 6% interest. So the Ford Motor Company pays a lot more than that $1,100 that appeared in that. It may have been that for some acreage somewhere, but in general, this was a concerted effort on the part of Henry Ford, his landman, and in agreement with Ford Motor Company to purchase these acres. And that there's another illustration closer to the river this time and looking north towards factory buildings being constructed. And this classic image shows that ship docking port, and that is the mouth of what had originally been Rouleau Creek. And now you've seen where that was on the map in the earlier slides. So Miller Road would still there to the right of this plant as you're looking at it. Central Michigan tracks, and then the Maple Road is obscured, but further to the left of this image. And you're looking up from the south. Now, it's not our purpose today to discuss the Rouge more broadly. This summer, I had the pleasure of doing an innovation journey with the learning and engagement crew at the Henry Ford. And we looked more into how Henry Ford really attempted to recreate a bucolic landscape, or you could say create a bucolic landscape at Fairlane with Jens Jensen's landscape architecture plans, including the construction of the dams, the Rouge from Fairlane. And you can see some of the architectural or flagstone, I guess, landscaping there along the river. And then contrast that at the same time, still some old bridges allowed transportation on some of the period road systems of the time, dirt roads, wooden bridges. So this small area is still a fascinating example of both modern technology and entrepreneurial activity and traditional agriculture and horse-drawn and walking methods of transportation. And then, as I said, it's not my place to go beyond the time that we were discussing, which is really 15 to 18 in the farming on the Rouge. But Ford also develops the industry up the river with water turbines and more management of that Rouge River. And then the maps of that into the World War II period that document the investment that he made in this river that, I mean, he took an interest in from its headwaters really and beyond to the Detroit River and beyond. So that actually is the bulk of this talk. I have time for questions, but I also put this forward in the spirit of spring training theoretically starting very soon, and with the hopes that we'll have baseball in Walnut Grove this year. thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to field questions if anyone has comments, corrections, always appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb, for this wonderful talk. It's been so interesting to think about how the Rouge River played such a big part in the history of our local area. So let's move into some of those questions. We have a few more in already. For those who've watched the program today, please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit some more, or the chat feature if you have that open as well. Let's start with the ones that we have so far. The first question is, why don't we know the names of some of these farm families?
Oh, yes, that's a good question. Well, I mentioned briefly that some of them don't show up in all the records. So the tenant farmers, or the farmers that rented their property, would show up on a census record at the 10-year time. So 1860, 1870, 1880, but tenant farmers might move. So there could be long periods of time when you wouldn't know the name of the farm family that happened to farm a property. They're not, unless they might take out a mortgage, and then there might be a record in the county courthouse about a lien that they were contracted, obligated to repay, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to link them to a particular piece of property. So it can make it really difficult to figure out who individuals were or where they were farming if they didn't actually own their property.
Oh, that is a puzzle. Wow. And the next question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, one of the reasons why it's so important to know who the landowners were, because sometimes you can find out through the landowners who they rented to. And the Dinan Brothers records, the wholesale grocers, I would love to look at those records, because they would have the names of who they contract with to raise, very specific quantities of fresh fruits and vegetables.
Absolutely. We've got a couple more questions coming in about the farms. The first would be, are these farms, and I think the person asking the question means like the ones shown in the early map or maybe on the census record page, are these the same as what we've heard called the ribbon farms along the Detroit River?
Yes, yes, partly. The Burbank farm, the photograph that we saw, that definitely would have qualified as a ribbon farm. Now, it's important to put ribbon farms into a chronology, because they're established by a specific culture as a French land settlement system. But then the Americans, and then people of many different ethnic origins, when they're buying land, the land records are all established on the basis of that French survey system, not the American survey system of township and range lines. So the people that operated farms that happened to be land that was initially surveyed as a ribbon farm didn't necessarily start those farms, if that makes any sense. So it's a wonderful cultural, not clash, but cultural combination that those French survey lines survived so long.
Absolutely, and that's a great segue into the next question. Is it known when the last ribbon farm in the vicinity of the Rouge plant ceased farming operations?
Oh, that's a great question. So I'm going to go back, and pardon me, I know that's always frustrating, but yes, I have to go quite a ways back to this, because this is 1915, and this is what existed when Ford begins to buy the property. And within 3 years, it's being all torn up, and the Rouge being built. And do you see there are long lots? So from as I point with my pencil, which no one can see how these long lots radiate? This is the long lot survey system. And some of those long lots had simply been sold off in pieces over the years by various owners, so that they went parallel. So the original long lot was from the river, north or south, or east or west. It depended on the way the river flowed, but everybody needed a piece of the river. But with changing transportation systems, look what happens. There's a road. So now people have to have land that they can get access to the road. And so these, what had originally been long lots, get parceled out so that instead people have a road right of way. So all of those are technically the result of long lots, and those folks that are farming those long lots are doing it until the construction of the Rouge.
Oh, wow. And you mentioned that, there was sort of a transportation element involved in some of these changes. We have another question asking, did the river have a transportation purpose to the factory, or was that the railroad's purpose? Was the river mostly important because of the water supply?
Another great question. Have any of you had to wait while the drawbridge at Ford Road up raises and lowers? And that is, and then in that one slide, there was the ore hauler that was, ready to go into that docking station to unload. So from the very beginning, Ford modified the Rouge up to the plant so that those heavy ships, those ore carriers, could make their way to the factory. So the river continued to be important for navigation. And just to bring it full forward, it was, I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to participate in the Friends of the Rouge uncruise this past summer, but they actually took kayakers and they gave a tour of the Rouge from the vantage point of the kayaker. So, I mean, right now, there's efforts to make the Rouge navigable for both recreational, kayaks, but it continues to be a heavy ship channel down there from the Rouge to the Detroit River. And I know I am not an expert in this, as many of you who are experts will know, but it's fascinating as I keep trying to learn how this river can support both of these things.
Absolutely. There's another question kind of more specifically about the river. How did the Rouge River get its red French name?
Oh, I'm going to have to rely on experts in the audience to answer that. I don't know. And I wouldn't even begin to guess. So if anyone knows the answer, feel free to type it in the Q&A as an A.
That'll be great. Let's see. Next question kind of goes back to some of the farmers that you have been able to identify. Have you tracked down or tried to track down any descendants of those early farm families?
Not directly, not aggressively. When we talk with presenters at the Rouge, sometimes they'll say, I know a person who's descended from a person that did live in that place. So there is, as you can imagine, a lot of work yet to be done. And I would say, plus, there are the millions of archival documents in the Henry Ford collection that remain to be explored. So yes, we know we need to do a lot, but I hope that those who are here today think that it's important work to be done. So if any of you also know anyone who would be willing to share images or family materials, we, of course, as a history museum, we love the originals, but we also have a very careful policy about what we call digital surrogates. So families can retain their originals, but could, if they were interested, give the rights of a digital surrogate to us. for use in programming like this.
Oh, wow.
And a digital surrogate specifically of like a plat map or a deed or a family photo of farmsteads. Wouldn't it be cool if you could do a historic tour of the Rouge and look at all the different farms like the Burbank farm? We have a long way to go to get there.
Absolutely. And here's an interesting question. This is very, very timely to how we're living today. Was the factory construction slowed down significantly due to the 1918 pandemic?
Well, see, that's another brilliant question that I hadn't even thought about. So yes, another thing, there's more to know. I will share that with Matt Anderson, our trusty Ford historian and transportation curator, and see what he knows.
Absolutely. We have a couple. We have a couple of those answers coming into the Q&A.
Oh, good.
Just getting back to the question about the name, the Rouge River, and it looks like folks are saying it's kind of about the reddish color of the mud, which is kind of interesting. So thanks, folks, for submitting some of the answers.
Yes.
Next, here's a great question. Did any of the buildings from the farms get saved, and as the Rouge Complex was developed?
Not to my knowledge. So I shared very few of those Rouge construction photos. And we know that when Ford purchased other land that remained in agricultural production, so the Ford farm lands, that he often kept the buildings in place, modernized them if needed, and had them as homes for employees. Sometimes the very family that he bought them from originally. But I believe that the landscape at the Rouge was cleared, but whether those buildings were moved elsewhere, I don't know. These are all perfect questions and the kinds of things that keep us curators busy.
Well, here's another good one. In the 1915 map, is that a subdivision at the mouth of the river? Did Ford have to buy out the whole subdivision?
Yes, that's another perfect question. And and part of that is whether it's individually owned properties or whether they're properties that are owned by one person. I don't know the answer to that. I have looked specifically at the farm acreage. There was a name for these different, the names are not on this map, but there were names for these little subdivisions. And it causes me to wonder if maybe Ford Bryan and the book Rouge, pictured in its prime, might have some of that more specific information.
And another question about how the land was acquired for the complex. Was the price Ford paid for the Rouge property generous, market price, or lower than average?
Yes, that's another good question. And that is an absolutely perfect question. I have not compared what Ford was paying for these properties with what others might have been paying. And I being not a statistician, I think there'd have to be some additional analysis, because this is real estate that's made prime real estate specifically because of an entrepreneur's vision for a new factory. So I'm not sure, I would honestly say he'd have to pay more than market. He'd have to pay at least market value to secure it. But I also don't like to make assumptions. I do not believe that anybody sold him property because he was their friend Henry. I think this was a very serious business venture. And the fact that there's these general averages of about $1,600 per acre, it just seems to me that that, yeah, I've talked myself into a corner without answering the question. But I do not believe that he undercut anyone's, you know what I mean? So I'll see if I can figure out a way to find out based on other sales in the area at the time how his purchase prices compared.
Excellent. There's always, every question is an opportunity for more research projects, right?
Yes, yes.
Excellent. Here are two that are kind of tied back to the farms again. The first question is, what were the majority of crops grown? And then getting more specific, what were the cash crops of that era? What was selling at the market? Maybe for some of those truck farmers.
Yes, so I will answer the part about the cash crops by turning to William Ford, who was just outside of this area, and his acreage, and it was about 180 acres that he farmed raising grain. Grain was, especially wheat, was one of the most lucrative cash crops in the area. He also sold wood at the wood market, sold hay at the hay market, both of which are those markets that are in Detroit. One to the east, which was the wood market, and one to the west, which was the hay market, and in the middle was Central Market. We wonder if Ford, with his, I think he had 300 or 400 apple trees, whether seasonally he would also take apples or contract with somebody to buy those apples. So I think the point is that there were general farmers, and William Ford would have been one. And at the time that I showed you 1910 census, the Dubke and Daigle are the truck farmers, but up here, the Schmitz and Mr. Schneider, who you can't see way up there at the top of the map, were the general farmers. So the ones towards the top of the map would have been cultivating hay for their livestock for dairy, and for, well, maybe sheep, but I mean, mostly dairy at this time. Raising vegetables for themselves, perhaps raising for the Dinan brothers, whose, you know, their property's located right between them. Dubke and Daigle, on the other hand, are going to be raising for market, and that could be anything because there's no specificity what they're raising as truck farmers. But it could have been root crops, potatoes, beets, carrots, could have been turnips, cabbages, sweet potatoes. I mean, anything that you might look for in your, almost anything you might look for in your green or the vegetable part, fresh vegetable part of the local grocery store, except for avocados or something like that, you know, those imports. And then everything would be seasonal. So there might be some that had a strawberry patch, and they had orchards for, you know, apples and peach trees. So, I mean, really, there is no specialization, or very little of it, still in 1915.
Wow, that is quite a lot of variety. So the next question actually gets back to the kind of the industrial life of the area. Why did Henry Ford focus on this particular place to build a factory?
It was next to the Rouge River. That really is key. And the person who had asked about transportation networks before, Ford very carefully bought the land between the Michigan Central tracks and the Rouge. So it is a, yeah, strategic location. And it just happens that he'd grown up next to it, and I mean, very nearly next to it. and undoubtedly had gone to school with children who, by the time he started to buy it, were his own age.
Oh, wow. It's quite a history and between, his relationship with the land. And this next question again is kind of about the development of the complex. Was there a groundbreaking or any kind of ceremonial event when Henry Ford started construction on the Rouge Complex?
Another question that I'm sure there's somebody out there who can answer. I can't imagine that there wouldn't have been a groundbreaking. But I don't know. I have no idea when that would be. Yeah, or whether one happened.
More to research, right?
Yes, I've got some notes. I'm quickly looking through, but yes, I do not see a date in 1918. I see a letter dated June 10th, 1918, when, yeah, that had to do with a Ford Motor Company transfer back to Mr. Padmore of very few acres, but yeah, no, sorry. That's another Matt question. We'll defer it to Matt or to our experts in the audience.
Excellent. So I think this will be our last question, and this is actually one directly for you, Deb. How did Deb get interested in studying agriculture and the environment?
I grew up on a farm, so I can't imagine doing anything other than, well, I love work, I love farming, but there's a lot of risk in farming, and it seemed less risky to try to teach. And then it just sort of evolved over many decades to, in 2017, I came back to the Henry Ford for the third time to do this job. There is no other collection comparable and no end to the amazing stories to tell. So it's a real dream come true to be able to do this here.
Excellent. Well, thank you again to Deb and to everyone joining us for today's special member program. You guys know we love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members. And we're so grateful that you continue to connect with us safely in our virtual programs. If you enjoyed today's program, I hope you'll join us again next month for the next one. After today, we will officially be offering our virtual programs for members as part of our ongoing series, THF Conversations. And I hope you'll join us for the next members only THF Conversations. We'll preview our upcoming exhibit, Lewis Comfort Tiffany, Treasures from the Dry House Collection. Our own curator, Charles Sable, will highlight some of the must-see pieces from the exhibit, and he's also going to share his insight into Tiffany's life and influences, along with a few behind-the-scenes stories from some Tiffany treasures in our collections here at the Henry Ford. So as we wrap up today, thank you to our partners in membership at DFCU. And of course, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford. So we'll see you next time.
Thank you.